how likely do you think it is that they'll try it? That they'll try to ban the consumption of meat as part of a larger program of trying to rectify green problems, we'll call them. And I ask you this because there's a lot of odd news going around out there. We've seen stories about how the plant-based meat alternatives are not selling as well as they have, that as the powers that shouldn't be think they should sell. We've seen attempts by some governments to limit nitrogen, as we've seen in Northern Europe, and some whispers of it in Canada. We've seen the sudden ridiculous increased cost of energy in the United States done by the stroke of a pen from our glorious leaders in D.C. And we also have heard there are some reports more in fringe media that a certain leader from a certain economic forum has demanded that governments give his little organization governmental control over actual independent states. And I have to ask you this. How much do you believe these reports? And how much are they really the extrapolations of independent people who are just looking for clicks and looking to generate ad revenue on their fringe websites, or tip jar bucks or whatever? And how much of this do you think they'll actually try? And I ask you this question because we are, September of 2023, when you're watching this, when 99% of you will see this. And we are not far, at least in the US, away from truly crazy season. And truly crazy season is when everything, and I do mean everything, gets nauseatingly political, more so than it already is. And that's saying something, because for the last several years, it has been politics nonstop everywhere you turn. You turn on a movie, you turn on music or sports radio. You try to do things that aren't political, and there's political or social activism always in the, at least in the peripheries of it. You're bombarded with it. But we're entering into soon-to-be crazy season. You may have noticed that there are presidential candidates running around out there trying to sell you on their program for what they want to do. And everyone's got opinions on that. And I'm not here to give you my opinion on that stuff, other than to warn you, everything is going to get much more political than it has been. And that's saying something. And over all of this, of course, for carnivore, keto people, and people who just have a basic understanding that human beings are, at the very least, omnivores, if not actually full-on carnivores, and that we're supposed to eat animal flesh, that's actually part of the, central to the proper human diet and to the experiences of human beings historically. In all of this is this observation, this undeniable observation that the system itself is trying to get you to consume less meat. I've covered some of these stories in the last couple of weeks. You remember that story where they demonized people for eating red meat in America by saying it's only 12% of people who eat something like 60 or 70% of the meat. That apparently the rest of the population are eating mostly, chicken, and allegedly diving into plant-based alternatives. But I just showed you a story a couple of days ago where that's actually not true, that people seem willing to accept the idea that this stuff is healthier. They try the product once and then they never try it again because the stuff tastes nasty. It's just objectively true. But we know that there is an attempt to sort of impose this. And we have news now, for instance, that the coming food bill, that there's a food bill, finally there's an agricultural farm bill and a food bill being debated by Congress, that they're going to do some giveaways to help make this happen, that they're going to do things to help the plant-based food industry actually make more money. If they create market incentives for them that will drive those costs down, they expect to see more people adopt those plant-based alternatives. That's one way that some would say is a freedom-respecting way of doing it. That remains to be seen, and I would be surprised if that managed to get through this very divided Congress that the U.S. has at the moment. But it's on the agenda. And this is the question I have for you. How much of this talk of imposing a ban on meat or restricting or curtailing your consumption of meat do you believe is real and likely to happen? And I say this because we know that there's got to be careful how you talk about this stuff on our happy little platform here, but you know that there's this program, we'll call it, that's supposed to be implemented by the end of the decade, and that the powers that shouldn't be behind it have all agreed to speed up the process, meaning they're not waiting to the end of the decade. They're trying to achieve it early on. And they've got these, smart cities and 15-minute cities they want to build, one of which is being built right now in Saudi Arabia, and whispers of another one being built in Hawaii. And I gotta ask, combining that with the news of that there are 40 cities, many of them in America and Europe, that are promising to limit by mid-century consumption of meat somehow. I don't know how they're going to pull that off unless you don't leave the cities and they restrict what can come in. And then, of course, suddenly you don't have any choice because you can't leave the city. They're planning to restrict the consumption of meat. We've seen this. But how likely do you think they were to pull this off? Because you may have noticed that regardless of whatever your political leanings are, there's a general distrust of people with institutional power now. It's good, and it's more than just like sort of what's always underlied the American sort of political experience. It's overt, and it crosses ideological boundaries. I mean, after all, if you're watching a carnivore diet video, you may not agree with the conservative bent that clearly most of the commentators in this space tend to have, but you can't help but think that everything we've been told about nutrition is wrong because you don't trust the nutritional authorities anymore. I mean, why would you? You just look at the data. You look at unmistakable data that says for the past century in America and then afterwards in the West, as plant oils entered the food system, all the negative health outcomes we see all exploded. As processed foods more entered the food system, we've seen these problems get worse. And on top of all that was a narrative to eat less red meat and then eventually less meat in general, and to eat the foods that were the cause of this. No one in this space, regardless of what they might believe on tax policy or hot-button social issues, disagrees with that. And yet it's clear that there are some with power who want people to really triple down on that, to eat more processed plant-based proteins, because let's be real, plant proteins are for the most part heavily processed. You can only get so much protein eating beans and lentils. But those patties you can buy in the frozen food aisle or in the meat department, those are heavily processed, including some ingredients that have never really been tested on human beings. We know this from Beyond Meat and Impossible, and the substance in them that mimics the bleeding you get when you cook a hamburger or a steak. That substance is thought to have cause problems in human beings, but again, it hasn't been heavily tested yet. And so I'm curious, I need to know this. What do you think the chances are that they're going to actually try this? And what do you think the chances are of them being successful, if you believe it? I'm not sure, personally. I try to avoid the really paranoid thinking about this stuff because I don't have enough energy in my day to worry about this stuff. But also, what would you do to preserve your own right to proper human health and a proper human diet in your own life? My solution personally is to embrace local solutions. Get to know your rancher. Get to know your local farmers. Buy as much of your food as you can locally. Support local grocers. There's a small grocery store in my town that gets everything, or at least 95% of their products, from farmers and ranchers within the broader Oklahoma City metro area. There's 2 or 3 outlets of the store in my area. I don't visit it as often as I should, but I do try to support them when I can. I still have a freezer full of meat from the cow that I bought last fall. Actually, we need to work on finishing that up so I can start thinking about whether to buy another one or not. The point I have here is clearly there's a chatter going on, and clearly it's not limited to one ideological side of the spectrum, because I can point to you politicians who we typically think these are like progressives doing this, and sure, statistically, most of them are, but I can show you politicians from the other side who are associated with that certain form of economics, and that would make them complicit, right? I mean, so what are the chances that they're going to try to actually achieve this, and what are the chances you think that they might be successful? And what can you do to resist it, aside from turning out in large numbers and, filling in the bubble of a candidate that you think will stand in opposition to this stuff? Something more concrete than that. Let me know what you think of that in the comments, and what do you think of the chances of this happening are. Anyway, thanks for tuning in today. I'm Anthony Stine, Practical Carnivore.